The candles on the cake were still burning when my mother-in-law set down her wine glass, looked directly at me across the table, and said, in the same pleasant voice she'd used to comment on the weather, "You know he only married you because I asked him to." I think it's time everyone stopped pretending otherwise. My name is Renee. I'm 41 years old, and I had been married to her son for 16 years when she said those words, smiling, in front of 12 dinner guests, 2 of our closest friends, and our 14-year-old daughter, who set down her fork and went very still. I run a small interior design practice out of a studio on Lexington Avenue in Asheville, mostly residential work, kitchens and primary suites, the occasional full home renovation for clients with more money than vision who need someone to tell them, gently, what actually works. I'm good at my job. I'm good at reading a room, at sensing what people want before they know how to ask for it. I have spent 16 years being good at reading rooms, and I did not see this one coming. Mark, my husband, Patricia's son, laughed first. A short, uncomfortable laugh, the kind people make when they're hoping the joke will resolve itself if no one takes it too seriously. "Mom," he said, "that's not okay, let's not do this tonight." But Patricia didn't retreat. She never retreated. She picked her wine glass back up, took a slow sip, and said, "I'm not being dramatic, Mark. I'm being honest. I told you 16 years ago that Renee was the sensible choice, and I was right. Look at everything you've built." She gestured around the dining room of the house I had spent 4 years renovating myself, the house Patricia had helped finance, the house she still, in certain unguarded moments, referred to as the investment. I sat very still, my hands flat on the table, and felt something in my chest go quiet in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. Around the table, conversations had stopped. My daughter, Hazel, was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, not confusion exactly, but the dawning understanding that something fundamental about her family had just shifted shape in front of her. I had built an entire identity, across 16 years, around being the calm one in this family. The one who didn't make scenes. The one who smoothed things over, who absorbed Patricia's comments with a patient smile because that was simply what you did with Patricia, you let her have her moments, you didn't take the bait, you kept the peace because the peace was worth more than the fight. I smiled that night too. I said something light, something about Patricia's sense of humor, and I watched the table exhale in relief, watched conversation resume, watched Mark's shoulders drop 2 inches as the danger passed. But underneath the table, my hands had curled into fists in my lap, and I understood, sitting there in the candlelight of my husband's 43rd birthday, that I had just been told something true for the first time in 16 years, and that everyone at that table, including me, had just helped bury it. I want to go back, because I think it matters, to before that dinner, to the years that made it possible for a comment like that to land the way it did. I met Mark when I was 24, newly graduated, working an entry-level position at a design firm in Charlotte that did contract work for Patricia's hospital system. Patricia was the administrator overseeing our renovation project for the new wing. I met Mark at the ribbon cutting, where he'd come to support his mother, and there was something easy about him, funny in a low-key way, attentive in a way that felt rare among the men I'd dated. We started talking. Within 8 months we were engaged. It happened fast. I told myself, at the time, that fast meant certain, that when something is right, you simply know, and the speed is evidence of that rightness rather than a warning sign. I believed that completely. I think I needed to believe it. What I didn't fully register, in those early months, was how present Patricia was in every part of it. She helped plan the wedding, not as a supportive mother-in-law offering input, but as something closer to a project manager, with opinions on the venue, the guest list, even, gently but unmistakably, on me. "Renee's so grounded," she'd say to her friends, within my hearing, in a tone that I would only later understand wasn't entirely a compliment. Exactly what Mark needs. I took it as approval. I was, at 24, hungry for that kind of approval. My own mother had passed when I was 19, and there was something in Patricia's confident, take-charge warmth that filled a space I hadn't known was empty. The power imbalance was there from the beginning, if I'm honest. Patricia had money, status in the community, a network of connections that smoothed every practical obstacle in our path, the house we eventually bought, the school Hazel would attend, even, indirectly, the early growth of my own design business, which got its first real clients through referrals that traced back, one way or another, to Patricia's circle. I told myself this generosity was simply how the family operated. I told myself it didn't change anything fundamental between Mark and me. I see now how much it changed. At the time, I just felt grateful. Grateful, and increasingly, quietly aware that gratitude and obligation can start to feel identical if you hold them long enough. For most of those 16 years, our life looked, from the outside, like exactly what people assume a good marriage looks like. Mark worked in commercial real estate, steady and successful in the unglamorous way that pays well without drawing attention. I built my design practice from a one-room office into a small but respected studio with 3 employees. We raised Hazel in a house with good light in a garden I'd designed myself, and on the surface, nothing about our life suggested anything was wrong. But there were currents underneath that surface I'd learned to navigate without naming. Patricia called Mark every Sunday, a standing ritual that had existed since before I'd entered the picture and that I'd simply absorbed into the rhythm of our marriage without question. The calls usually lasted 40 minutes to an hour. I rarely heard Mark's side of them. He took them in his office, door mostly closed, and emerged afterward in a mood I came to recognize but never fully understood, slightly deflated, slightly more compliant than he'd been an hour earlier, as if some argument he didn't know he was having had just been quietly settled in someone else's favor. I noticed this pattern. I noticed it for years, actually, in the particular way you notice something without letting yourself examine it too closely. A glance at the clock when his office door stayed closed past the usual hour, a small flicker of something across his face when he came out, gone before I could name it. I didn't ask him about it. Not because I didn't want to know what was discussed in those calls, but because some part of me understood, instinctively, that asking would require us to acknowledge something neither of us had agreed to acknowledge, that Patricia's influence in our marriage operated on a frequency I wasn't fully included in, and that Mark, despite being a grown man with a wife and a child and a career of his own, had never quite finished the process of separating from his mother's authority. There was a Tuesday, about 3 years into the marriage, when I overheard the tail end of one of those Sunday calls through the door Mark had forgotten to fully close. I caught only a fragment, Patricia's voice, brisk and certain, saying something like, "You knew what you were signing up for, Mark, we talked about this before the wedding," and then the door clicked shut the rest of the way. And I went back to the kitchen and finished making dinner and did not ask Mark, later that evening, what his mother had meant. That's the kind of detail you file away and call unimportant. It's only later, turning it over and over, that you understand you were holding a thread that, if you'd pulled it even slightly, might have unraveled something much sooner than it eventually did. Patricia herself was never cruel in any way I could point to directly, that was, I'd come to understand, precisely the architecture of her control. She gave generously, hosted beautifully, remembered every birthday and anniversary with thoughtful, expensive gifts. To the outside world, and even to most of the family, she was simply a devoted mother and grandmother, perhaps a touch overbearing, but never unkind. The control showed up instead in smaller currents, a comment here, a gesture there, each one deniable on its own, each one accumulating over years into something that shaped the actual structure of our family without ever being named as such. When Mark and I disagreed about anything significant, where to send Hazel to school, whether to take a job offer in another city, how to renovate the kitchen, Patricia's opinion would somehow find its way into the conversation, gently, almost accidentally, and somehow Mark's position would shift to align with hers within a day or two, framed always as his own independent conclusion. I noticed this. I want to be honest about that. I noticed it for years, and I told myself it was simply how families like Mark's operated, families with money and history and a matriarch whose influence ran deep enough that questioning it felt almost rude, almost ungrateful, given everything she'd provided. My own background was different, modest, careful, a single working mother who'd raised me alone after my father left when I was 6. I had grown up watching my mother stretch every dollar, watching her exhaustion, and some part of me, entering Patricia's world at 24, had been genuinely dazzled by the ease of it. The sense that money and influence could simply smooth over the hard edges of life that I'd always understood to be unavoidable. I think that dazzlement made me slower to question things I might otherwise have questioned. I think I needed, more than I understood at the time, to belong to a family that looked the way Patricia's did from the outside, solid, successful, untouched by the kind of precarity I'd grown up inside. I built an entire version of myself around fitting into that world gracefully, around being the daughter-in-law who never caused friction, who made Patricia's life easier rather than more complicated. I see now how much of myself I shaped around being exactly what that family needed me to be, and how little I asked, across 16 years, about what I actually needed in return. The unease started, in earnest, about 18 months before the birthday dinner, though I didn't recognize it as the beginning of anything at the time. It arrived in fragments, the way these things usually do. The first fragment was small. Joelle, Mark's younger sister, made an offhand comment at a family lunch about the whole arranged thing with Mark and me, then immediately backtracked, laughing, saying she'd meant something else entirely, changing the subject before I could ask her to clarify. I let it go. Joelle had always had a slightly chaotic relationship with tact, and I told myself I'd simply misheard, or that she'd been making some joke I wasn't fully in on. I didn't ask her about it later. I told myself there was nothing to ask. The second fragment came a few months after that, during a renovation project for one of Patricia's friends, a referral, like so many of my early clients had been. The friend, an older woman named Carol who clearly didn't realize the implications of what she was saying, mentioned, almost wistfully, how lovely it had been that Patricia found Mark such a steady match all those years ago. She always said she wanted someone who'd keep him grounded, Carol said, smiling at me as if this were a compliment. And she was right, wasn't she? Look how well it turned out. Found him a match. I remember the words landing strangely, sitting slightly wrong in my chest, like a piece of furniture placed at an angle that doesn't quite fit the room. I smiled at Carol and said something polite and finished measuring her bay window for custom drapery, and that evening I sat in my car in the studio parking lot for several minutes before driving home, turning the phrase over, trying to make it mean something other than what some quiet part of me suspected it might mean. I didn't bring it up with Mark. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into an old woman's imprecise language. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in how I listened to Patricia after that, a new attentiveness to the things she said about our marriage, our history, the early days of our relationship, things I'd absorbed for years as simply the warm, slightly possessive commentary of a mother who loved her son. The third fragment was the hardest to dismiss. About 6 months before the dinner, I was helping Patricia sort through old boxes in her attic. She was downsizing, planning to move into a smaller condo closer to the hospital where she still consulted part-time, and I came across an old daily planner from the year Mark and I met. Patricia's handwriting, dense and decisive, filled every page. On the date of the ribbon cutting where Mark and I had first spoken, she'd written, in the margin, a note that stopped my hands completely. Invite M, good prospect, sensible, hardworking, will keep our grounded as discussed. I stood there in the dusty attic light, holding that planner, and felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't yet have language for. As discussed. Discussed with whom? Discussed when? I had been at that ribbon cutting because of a work assignment, a coincidence of contracts and scheduling. I had always believed meeting Mark there had been chance. I put the planner back in the box. I didn't ask Patricia about it. I told myself, standing in that attic, that I needed more information before I let myself draw conclusions, that one ambiguous sentence in an old planner didn't prove anything, that I was perhaps building a narrative out of fragments that, examined individually, meant very little. That was true, as far as it went. But it was also true that some part of me was afraid of what asking might cost, not just my relationship with Patricia, who held more influence over our family's stability than I wanted to fully acknowledge, but my understanding of my own marriage, the foundation I'd built an entire adult life on top of. So I closed the box, and I carried it down from the attic, and I said nothing. After the attic, I couldn't fully unsee what I'd seen. The unease that had been background noise for months moved, slowly, into the foreground of my daily life. I started sleeping worse. Not dramatically, I wasn't lying awake in obvious distress, but I'd wake at 4 in the morning with my mind already moving, replaying fragments of conversation from years earlier, searching them for evidence I hadn't known to look for the first time around. I lost interest in food in a way that wasn't like me. I'd find myself pushing dinner around my plate, appetite simply absent, and have to remind myself to eat enough to function. I started watching Mark differently, too, not suspiciously, exactly, but with a new kind of attention. I noticed how often, in conversation, he deferred to some version of what Mom thinks even on matters that had nothing to do with Patricia directly. I noticed how he still, at 43 years old, seemed to brace slightly before answering his phone on Sunday afternoons. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of this story. I had the chance, during those months, to simply ask Mark directly. Did your mother arrange for us to meet? Did she push this marriage the way Carol implied? Was the early ease of our courtship something you chose, or something you were guided toward? I had that chance more than once, and I didn't take it. I told myself I needed more proof before raising something so serious. But underneath that reasonable-sounding caution was something closer to fear that asking the question out loud would force a reckoning I wasn't ready for, would require me to look directly at the possibility that the entire architecture of my adult life had been built on a foundation I hadn't fully chosen. So instead, I did what I'd always done well. I gathered information quietly, carefully, without disturbing the surface. I reached out to an old college friend of Mark's, Devin, who'd been his roommate during the year we met, ostensibly just catching up after years of lost touch. Over coffee, carefully, I steered the conversation toward that early period. Honestly, Devin said, laughing a little, clearly not understanding the weight of what he was about to hand me, I always thought it was a little funny how Patricia kept bringing up that ribbon cutting before it happened. Like, weeks before. She mentioned to Mark there'd be someone interesting there from the design firm. I remember teasing him about it, like, your mom's setting you up at a hospital wing opening, that's a new low, man. He laughed again. But you guys hit it off for real, so. I don't know. Worked out, I guess. I sat across from Devin with my coffee going cold and felt the floor of my understanding shift completely. Weeks before. She had known I was coming. She had told Mark to expect someone interesting. This wasn't an old woman's imprecise nostalgia. This was a planned introduction, dressed up afterward as coincidence, that both Mark and Patricia had allowed me to believe, for 16 years, was simply how we'd found each other. I drove home that afternoon with my hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the early months of our courtship, the speed of it, the way Patricia had been present at nearly every turn, the wedding planning that had felt, in retrospect, less like collaborative excitement and more like execution of a plan already in motion. I thought about the planner. Good prospect. As discussed. There was a moment, that evening, when I almost confronted Mark immediately, the words already forming, anger moving up through my chest faster than I could organize it into something coherent. I stood outside his office door, my hand actually raised to knock, and then I lowered it. I told myself I wanted to approach this calmly, with full information, not as an ambush. That was partly true. It was also true that I was terrified of what his answer might be, that some part of me already suspected he would not deny it, and once he confirmed it, I would no longer be able to live inside the comfortable uncertainty I'd been protecting for months. I went looking for Joelle instead. She'd been the one to first let something slip, months earlier, and I needed to know how much she actually knew. She told me, eventually, sitting in my car outside her house because she didn't want this conversation happening anywhere Patricia might hear about it secondhand. I've known for years, Renee, she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. Mom told me, back when it happened, she was proud of it, actually, like she'd solved a problem. She thought Mark was drifting, dating women she considered flighty, and when she met you through the hospital contract, she decided you were exactly what he needed. She arranged for him to be at that event. She encouraged things along after that, nothing forceful, just steering. I always assumed you knew, on some level, or that it didn't matter because you two actually fell for each other anyway. I'm sorry. I should have said something a long time ago instead of letting you find out like this. I didn't know it then, but Joelle had been carrying her own version of this weight for years. She told me, much later, what had been going through her mind every time the subject came close to the surface, and she'd changed the conversation instead. I knew the whole time, and I told myself it wasn't my story to tell. Mom had done it with the best intentions. As far as she was concerned, she genuinely believed she'd given Mark something good, given Renee something good too, even if neither of them had actually chosen it themselves. Every time I almost said something, I pictured the fallout, a mom's fury, the family fractured, Renee's whole understanding of her marriage collapsing because of words I'd said. I told myself silence was kindness. I think now it was cowardice wearing kindness as a disguise. I let Renee build 16 years on a story that wasn't entirely true, because telling her the truth felt harder than letting her keep believing the comfortable version. I sat with Joelle's confession for a long moment, the car engine ticking as it cooled, and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief but some new, unnamed thing occupying the space where my certainty about my own life used to live. I had proof now. I had Devon's account, Joelle's confirmation, the planner still sitting in a box in Patricia's attic. What I didn't yet have was the courage to use it. That came 3 weeks later, at Mark's birthday dinner, though not in the way I expected, not because I chose the moment, but because Patricia did. I had planned, in the days after talking to Joelle, to bring this to Mark privately, a quiet conversation, evidence laid out calmly, space for him to explain himself before anyone else needed to know. I had even rehearsed how I might begin it. I never got the chance to use any of those careful words. Patricia took that choice away from me at her son's birthday dinner, in front of 12 people, with a wine glass in her hand and a smile that suggested she believed she was simply stating something obvious and overdue. You know he only married you because I asked him to, she said. I think it's time everyone stopped pretending otherwise. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true and unwelcome has just been spoken aloud. Mark's nervous laugh. My own automatic smile, the one I'd perfected over 16 years of smoothing over Patricia's comments before they could land as damage. But something in me had already changed in the 3 weeks since Joelle's confession in my car, and I felt that change arrive fully, completely, sitting at that table, not as anger, not as the explosion I might have expected from myself, but as a strange, total stillness. A clarity so complete it felt almost peaceful. I looked at Patricia, and I did not smile this time. You're right, I said, and my voice came out level, quiet, carrying easily across the suddenly silent table. I do know that now. Devon told me about the ribbon cutting. Joelle told me you'd planned it for weeks before I ever met Mark. I found your planner in the attic, Patricia, good prospect, sensible, will keep our grounded as discussed. I know exactly what you did. Patricia's expression flickered, not guilt, not quite, but something closer to recalibration, the look of someone whose script has suddenly veered off the page they'd memorized. I don't know why you're making this sound sinister, she said, her voice rising slightly, gaining the offensive edge I recognized from 16 years of watching her redirect any conversation that threatened her control. I introduced 2 people who turned out to be wonderful together. Is that a crime now? You've had a beautiful marriage, a beautiful daughter, a successful business that, frankly, would not exist without the doors I opened for you. And this is the thanks I get, being attacked at my son's birthday dinner because I had the foresight to see something good before either of you were capable of seeing it yourselves? Around the table, I felt the room's sympathy beginning to shift, exactly as it always did when Patricia spoke this way, confident, wounded, righteous all at once. One of the dinner guests, a longtime family friend, murmured something about how lovely the marriage had turned out regardless of how it began. Mark sat frozen at the head of the table, his birthday candles long since extinguished, looking at neither me nor his mother. This isn't about whether the marriage turned out well, I said, and I felt my own voice stay remarkably steady even as something enormous moved underneath it. It's about the fact that I spent 16 years believing I chose this life, when actually I was selected for it. There's a difference, Patricia, even if you've never been able to see it. Don't be dramatic, Patricia snapped, and now the counterattack arrived in full, sharper than before. You make it sound like I forced him to marry you at gunpoint. He fell in love with you. That was real, whatever you want to believe about how you met. And frankly, Renee, I find it interesting that you're choosing tonight, of all nights, to make this about you, at his birthday, in front of his friends, instead of having this conversation privately like an adult. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the instinct to apologize, to smooth this over, to absorb the blame for poor timing rather than hold steady on what mattered. I recognized the reflex as it happened, the way you recognize a familiar weather pattern moving in, and for the first time in 16 years, I let it pass through me without acting on it. You're the one who said it out loud tonight, Patricia, I said quietly. Not me. I looked at Mark then, and something in my face must have communicated more than any words could have, because I watched him go very still, watched something pass across his expression that looked, for just a moment, like the man underneath 16 years of careful deference to his mother. Mark, I said, did you know I was at that event because your mother arranged it? Did you know, this whole time, and just never told me? He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, longer than was comfortable, longer than any answer would have taken to give, and in that silence I understood, fully, completely, with no room left for doubt, that whatever the truth of his own awareness had been, this conversation had been happening in some form, in some corner of our marriage, for 16 years, without me. I didn't know the details, he finally said, quietly. Not at first. I found out a few years in. I should have told you. I didn't know how, without it changing everything between us. I nodded slowly. I wasn't crying. I wasn't raising my voice. But something in my face, in that moment, made my mother-in-law go quiet for the first time all evening, not because she'd suddenly understood the harm she'd caused, but because she could see, finally, that whatever leverage her version of events had always held over me had just, permanently, stopped working. I think I'd like to go home, I said, standing, my voice still calm, still even. Hazel, get your coat. I didn't wait for anyone's response. I walked out of that dining room with my daughter beside me, and behind us I heard the dinner table erupt into the kind of chaotic, overlapping conversation that happens when a carefully maintained surface finally cracks in front of witnesses. In the car, Hazel was quiet for several minutes before she finally spoke. Is it true? She asked. What Grandma said. Some version of it, I told her, my hand steady on the wheel even as everything inside me had not yet caught up to the calm I was projecting. I'm still figuring out exactly what it means. But I wanted you to know what I just did back there, walking away instead of staying to keep the peace. That's not me being unkind to your grandmother. That's me finally being honest with myself. It was only that night, alone in my bathroom with the water running so no one would hear, that everything I'd held together at that table finally broke apart, not in anger, but in a long, quiet kind of grief I hadn't fully expected, for the version of my marriage I'd believed in for 16 years, and for the version of myself who'd needed to believe it. Mark came to find me 3 days after the dinner. I'd stayed at a friend's guest house since that night, not as a dramatic separation, but because I needed physical distance to think clearly, away from the house Patricia had helped finance, away from the rooms full of furniture I'd chosen to make a life I was only now beginning to fully understand. He sat across from me on the porch of my friend's house, and for a long time neither of us said anything. Then he started talking, and once he started, it came out in a single unbroken current, like something that had been waiting 16 years for permission. I need to tell you the whole thing, he said. Not the version I've been giving myself for years. The actual truth, even the parts that make me look small. I didn't interrupt him. I sat with my hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold and let him finally finish the story he'd been editing for 16 years. It started exactly the way you found out it started, he said. My mother told me there'd be someone interesting at that ribbon cutting. I went, mostly to humor her, the way I'd humored her about plenty of things before. I met you, and I want you to understand, what happened after that was real. I wasn't performing interest I didn't feel. I fell for you fast, completely, in a way I hadn't with anyone before. But somewhere in those first few months, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, how pleased she was that her instinct had been right about you. And I understood, in that moment, that this hadn't been chance. That she'd engineered the introduction and then stepped back to let it run its course, confident enough in her own judgment that she didn't think she needed to tell either of us. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the feelings were mine, even if the meeting wasn't entirely accidental, and that distinction felt important enough to build an entire silence around. That was the first lie I told myself, that the origin of something doesn't matter as long as what grows from it is real. I believed that, mostly, for years. It was easier to believe than the alternative. The thing I never told you, the thing I'm ashamed of more than anything else, is that I knew, on some level, that you deserved to know. Every few years, there'd be a moment where it would have been natural to tell you. Early in our marriage, when we were talking about how we met, laughing about the ribbon cutting like it was just a funny coincidence. After Hazel was born, when we were talking about the kind of honesty we wanted to model for her. A dozen small openings, over 16 years, where the truth could have come out gently, on my terms, in a way that might have hurt less than this. I didn't take any of them. Every time, I told myself the timing wasn't right, that bringing it up now would just cause unnecessary pain for something that had already worked out fine. But the real reason, and I've had 3 days to sit with this, Renee, so I'm not going to dress it up anymore, the real reason is that I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean about me, that I'd let my mother arrange the most important relationship of my life and then spent 16 years too comfortable, or too cowardly, to acknowledge it out loud. Afraid that telling you would force me to actually examine how much control she still had over decisions I'd convinced myself were entirely my own, not just meeting you, but 100 smaller things since. The house. Hazel's school. Even some of our worst arguments, if I'm honest, started with something my mother had said to me first. I kept choosing silence because silence let me keep being the version of myself I preferred, a man who'd built a good life through his own choices, not a man who'd been quietly managed by his mother since before he could legally drink. Every year that passed made the secret feel bigger, harder to bring up, until it felt less like a fact I was withholding and more like a wall I'd built brick by brick, and I didn't know how to tell you it existed without you seeing the whole structure at once. I'm not asking you to forgive any of this tonight. I don't think I've earned that. I just needed you to hear it from me, completely, instead of in pieces from Devin or Joelle or my mother's planner. You deserved the whole truth a long time ago. I'm sorry it took losing you, even temporarily, for me to finally give it to you. I sat with what he'd said for a long time after he finished, the coffee fully cold in my hands, the porch light drawing moths against the screen. I believe you, I finally said. I believe the feelings were real. I think that's actually the hardest part to sit with, not that none of it was true, but that some of it was, and I still don't know how to hold both things at once. That I was chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and that love grew there anyway. I need time to understand what that means about the last 16 years, and what it means about what comes next. We didn't resolve everything on that porch. I want to be honest about that. There was no single conversation large enough to undo 16 years of unexamined architecture. But it was the beginning of something more honest than what we'd had before, even if neither of us knew yet exactly what shape that honesty would eventually take. Patricia called twice in the weeks that followed. I let both calls go to voicemail. When I finally did speak with her, months later, at a school event for Hazel that neither of us could avoid without making our daughter pay the price of our conflict, Patricia attempted, once, to revisit her justification. I only ever wanted good things for this family, Renee. Surely you can see that now with some distance, and I found, to my genuine surprise, that I no longer felt the need to either accept or argue with that framing. I simply said, I understand that's how you experienced it, Patricia. I experienced something different. We don't have to agree about that for us to find a way to coexist for Hazel's sake. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't quite peace either. But it was the first time in 16 years I'd spoken to my mother-in-law without first calculating what version of myself she needed me to be in order to keep things smooth. In the months since, I've made smaller, steadier changes, the kind that don't make for dramatic stories but that have quietly reshaped the architecture of my own life. I stopped attending every Sunday family dinner out of obligation. I go when I want to go, and Hazel and Mark understand, without explanation needed anymore, why that's different than it used to be. I started saying, plainly, what I actually think in family conversations, rather than translating my opinions into whatever version Patricia would find least objectionable. I took on a major design project entirely on my own merit, sourced through a referral that had nothing to do with Patricia's network for the first time in my career, and felt something settle in my chest when I realized how long it had been since I'd built something that was unmistakably, entirely mine. I am still married to Mark. I'm not certain, even now, exactly what that marriage will look like in 5 years, whether the honesty we're slowly building will be enough to hold what we have, or whether some part of what broke that night at his birthday dinner was never going to be fully reparable. I've made my peace with not knowing yet. What I do know is this: I am no longer the woman who needed to be exactly what everyone else required of her in order to feel like she belonged. That woman spent 16 years being good at reading rooms, at smoothing over hard truths, at becoming whatever shape kept the peace intact. I'm something else now, slower to smile automatically, quicker to say what I actually mean, less interested in being indispensable and more interested in simply being myself, even when that self is inconvenient for the people around me. There's a particular kind of red flag that hides in plain sight for years because it's wrapped in generosity instead of cruelty. Patricia's involvement never looked like control from the outside, it looked like love, like a mother who simply cared deeply about her son's happiness. I mistook that appearance for the reality underneath it for 16 years, and I understand now why. The alternative would have required me to question the very foundation I'd built my adult identity on top of, and some part of me always sensed that foundation was more fragile than I wanted to examine. Looking back, the planner in the attic wasn't really the turning point, it was simply the moment I could no longer unknow what some part of me had already suspected for years, in the closed office door every Sunday, in Carol's wistful comment about Patricia finding Mark a steady match. I had pieces of this story long before I had the whole of it, and I understand now that I wasn't blind to those pieces so much as unwilling to let them cost me the version of my marriage I needed to believe in. The real turning point came later, at that dinner table, in the moment I chose not to smile automatically at something designed to wound me. I had spent 16 years believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the love, that my value in this family rested on never being the source of friction. What I learned, finally, is that you can lose yourself so completely inside the role of peacekeeper that you stop noticing when the peace itself has become the thing costing you everything. I think, too, about Mark's confession on that porch, how much of his silence wasn't malice but a particular kind of cowardice that looks, from a distance, almost like love. He wasn't protecting me from the truth. He was protecting himself from having to examine what the truth meant about who he'd let himself become. I understand that now in a way I couldn't have understood it at 24, when I still believed that love alone was enough to explain everything. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about Patricia, or even about Mark. It was about the cost of becoming whatever shape the people around you need you to be, how easily, if you're not careful, an entire identity can be built around other people's comfort instead of your own truth, and how long it can take to notice the difference. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: notice when you're being asked to keep the peace at the cost of your own clarity. Notice the moments you smile instead of asking the question sitting right behind your teeth. You don't have to wait 16 years and a birthday dinner gone wrong to start asking it. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar, if some part of you recognized yourself in the daughter-in-law who kept the peace until the peace had quietly become her prison, let this be the moment you start asking anyway. I'm not angry anymore, most days. I'm something quieter than that now. Something that feels, finally, entirely my own.